Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode of Strange Days True Crime, where we look at stories of solved and unsolved murders and disappearances. So sit back and enjoy. The Investor Fishing Boat Murders. Mark Coldhurst was born on September 5th of 1954 to his father John, known as Big John, and mother unknown, in Whidbey Island, Washington, and had a sister named Lori. When Mark was around 16 years old, he was working at a motorcycle shop in Bellingham, Washington, and his boss had asked him if he wanted to go along on a fishing boat, and this began his journey into becoming a commercial fisherman. Once out of high school, Mark would build his own boat and started fishing and would have a good salmon season and fishing anything else he could. Soon Mark's catches were becoming too big, so he would build his own herring grill net drum. Mark was described as being a well-liked, ambitious, and hard-working skipper. Irene Hudson's parents, Frank and Hazel, would welcome her on January 8th of 1954 in Bellingham, Washington. Irene would meet Mark, and the pair would get married on December 6th of 1974, when they were both just 20 years old. Mark and Irene would welcome their first child, a daughter named Kimberly, in 1977, and just a year later, they would welcome another child, this time a boy named John, born in 1978. Mark and Irene would eventually purchase an expensive 58-foot-long fishing boat named the Investor that cost around $850,000, and Mark had big plans to retire when he was just 50. Mark had a crew on the ship that consisted of himself being the skipper, Mark's cousin 19-year-old Michael Stewart, who was a college student, 19-year-old Jerome Keon, who was also a college student, Dean Moon, who had just graduated and was a high school football star, and 17-year-old Chris Heyman, who would soon be turning 18. Mark had chose the men to be his crew as they all got along with one another. On September 5th of 1982, Mark, along with his wife Irene, who was 3 months pregnant with their third child, their two children, and crew members, Michael, Jerome, Dean, and Chris, who were all from Blaine, Washington, sailed the Investor to Craig, Alaska, and on their way had caught 77,000 pounds of salmon that they would offload in Craig on that afternoon. Mark was also well known to some of the other fishing crews, but not as well known to the locals in Craig. Craig, Alaska is a small remote fishing village located on the western coast of Prince of Wales Island and only covers 6.7 square miles, and in 1982 the population was around 600. The salmon would be sold, and Mark was to receive his payment of $30,000 the following day, only because the Game and Fishing Department had temporarily put a halt on the fishing season. Because of this delay, Mark and his family and crew would end up spending a day or two in Craig. Mark would take his boat into port and tie off to two other ships, the Decade and the Defiant, as there wasn't much room, which would mean that anyone getting onto the Investor would have to pass two other crews and boats, as it was the end of the season and there were about 150 other boats in the port. Mark and his family had decided to go for dinner at a local restaurant named Ruth Ann's to celebrate Mark's 28th birthday, and the other four crew members would go their own ways. It's unclear if Chris and Mike left the ship or not, and Jerome and Dean would head out together and return sometime later that night. Mark and Irene and their children would leave the restaurant around 9:30 p.m. and return to their boat around 10 p.m. that night. On that same night, the crew of the Decade, owned by Clyde Curry, who was the brother of John Curry, who was Mark's business partner, which the investor was tied to, was having a party, and one of the crew members had stated that 4-year-old John had stuck his head in to say goodnight, and then the party was in full swing. On the foggy morning of September 6th, around 6:30, one of the crew members from the Decade had noticed Mark's boat, the Investor, drifting away from the port. The man had said that he saw a man in the pilot house of the Investor and assumed it was Mark and waved. The man on the Investor would wave back. Some things struck the man as being odd. One being that the Investor had left their tie-down lines behind, which was strange as they were in good shape, so why would they leave them behind? And another was that it didn't appear that the Investor had its motor running. Later that day, people would see the Investor anchored down by a nearby island called Fish Egg Island, which was about 1 mile outside of Craig. Several witnesses stated that they saw a man coming back to the docks on the Investor's skiff and then going into a store. No one would suspect a thing, thinking that the Investor was just maybe getting a head start on the new fishing season. And according to some witnesses, the same man would use the Investor's skiff to go back and forth a few times, and it seemed he was getting things for the Investor as it had been there all day and night. The last time the man was seen was on September 7th of 1982, when witnesses stated he was taking jugs of gasoline out on the skiff to the Investor and would then return to never be seen again. Around 4:30 p.m. on the 7th, witnesses saw smoke coming from the boat that was anchored a mile out, and the crew of the casino would race out, and it was stated that they passed a young man on the Investor's skiff, who had stated he was on his way back to get help, and stated that everyone on board the Investor was safe. Once he reached the dock, he told the same story and would make a phone call, then disappear. Upon reaching the Investor, which was now in flames, the crew of the casino couldn't see any of the Investor crew members on the deck. The casino was not equipped with the right firefighting tools for such a blaze, and soon police and Alaska state authorities were on the scene of the burning Investor. It was said that the Investor had burned for a total of 42 hours before being put out. Once the fire was out, investigators would make a terrifying discovery. There were 4 bodies inside the burned-up boat, and they were burned so badly that it would take some time for investigators to identify all of them. Investigators would tow the burned boat to a nearby shore to prevent it from sinking, and to continue the search for any evidence as to what had happened aboard the Investor. During this time, as they sifted through the ash and remains of the boat, they discovered more bones and bone fragments, which would be sent off for potential identification. In total, the charred bodies of 7 people were found on the boat. The coroner had stated that both 28-year-old Mark and his 28-year-old pregnant wife Irene had been shot in the head multiple times, and that they were dead before the boat was set on fire, along with the rest of the crew, including Mark and Irene's 5-year-old daughter Kimberly. But the remains of 4-year-old John were never found, as it was believed that the fire burned so hot it left nothing behind of John. Investigators believed that all the crew members 19-year-old Jerome, Dean, Michael, and 17-year-old Chris were also shot to death before the fire started with a .22 caliber pistol, and Jerome had been identified by a jawbone. It was uncertain how little 4-year-old John was killed, as his body was never recovered due to the intense heat of the fire, but his sister Kimberly had been beaten over the head. Inside the burned wreckage, investigators found a .223 Ruger rifle, which was first believed to be the murder weapon, but were unable to confirm this, as the bullet fragments at the scene were too badly damaged. At this time, they didn't have a motive for the killer either. Because the investor was so badly burned, it left investigators with little to no clues as to who had killed the 8 members of the investor fishing boat. But they believed the killer had moved the boat to Eggfish Bay with the intent of sinking the boat by trying to flood the engine room. But when this didn't work, the killer went back and set fire to the boat. Their only lead was from eyewitnesses who had seen the young man on the investor's skiff the day of the fire. The man was described as a white male in his early 20s who had a pock-marked complexion. The investor's skiff would be located tied to the dock with no one in sight. Police would spend the next few months going between Gregg, Blair, and Bellingham, searching for leads, looking for witnesses, and conducting dozens of interviews. The case would leave the news headlines, but remained in the forefront of Craig locals. Fishermen would come up with a $15,000 reward, as they were worried the killer could be among them, and it was at this point that police released a sketch of a potential suspect based from eyewitnesses. It was believed that the man seen leaving the investor skiff may have left Craig on another fishing boat, so the flyers were handed out to as many fishing vessels as possible. Police would state the man they were looking for was a white male in his late teens or early 20s, having a slim build, weighing around 160 pounds, and stood between 5 foot 9 inches and 6 feet tall, and had light brown or blonde hair. The man had a scarred complexion and wore rectangular glasses, but not all of the witnesses had the same description of the man. Some witnesses had stated that the man was middle-aged and may have had a native appearance. Most of the witnesses were more focused on the blaze on the water than anything else. Because it was the end of the fishing season, many of the people there that day would go home soon after. The case would sit with not much movement for months. There was a theory that because not all of the crew members from the investor could be identified, that it was possible that one of them may have been responsible for the murders. However, investigators could not eliminate or ignore that this was a possibility. In the spring of 1984, a presumptive death hearing was held where an Alaskan court determined that all 8 members of the investor had died on the boat. Mark, his wife Irene, and their daughter, along with Jerome and Mike, had been recovered and identified, leaving Mark's son John, crew members Chris and Dean, who were never identified, to be declared dead. Investigators would narrow the search to 3 suspects in 1984, and then to just 1. It wouldn't be until 2 years after the murders, on September 10th of 1984, that investigators made an arrest in the case. Police would arrest 24-year-old John Kenneth Peel at his place of work in Bellingham. At the time of the murders, John was working on another fishing boat in Craig and had worked for Mark in the past until Mark had fired him and the pair had a falling out. Investigators would also state that John also matched the description the witnesses had seen on the investor's skiff and identified John from a photograph as being that man. Investigators also said that he had a grudge against Mark for being fired. They stated that John was identified as the man who had bought the gas that morning as well. Police stated that John had sold Dean Moon some drugs that night, and that later, when John was drunk in a bar, he supposedly told another man how "you should have known the boat would have sunk." But these statements are not confirmed. John would make an appearance in court wearing a ski mask and bulletproof vest and was charged with 8 counts of murder and first-degree arson. However, John had no prior arrests and a clean slate. He had gotten married in 1981 before his arrest and had a son with his wife. It was stated that the reason Mark had fired John was because of John's substance abuse, but things didn't add up. John had dated Mark's sister for 3 years, and when John had gotten married, Irene and Mark had bought him a wedding present. So it did not seem as though there was any bad blood between the two, as they also had some of the same social circles. It was also stated that Mark and John had been seen talking at the restaurant the night of the murders, which seemed to be pleasant. John had been resentful towards Mark for being fired, but got over it and moved on. Investigators stated that not only did John match the description some witnesses had given, but they also had circumstantial evidence and physical evidence against John. It was not confirmed, but said that John had taken a polygraph test in which he had failed. August of 1985, the judge dismissed all the charges against John before the case would make it to trial, but stated that John could be charged again for the crimes, but the prosecution needed to have more evidence against him in order to do so. In the coming months, that was what they would try to do. October of that same year, John would be indicted for a second time, and this time the prosecutors were going to rely on eyewitnesses from that day. During the trial, which took place in January of 1986, John's lawyer had stated that none of the eyewitnesses would or could actually place John at the scene, and that John's character testimony was solid. John's lawyer would also prove that. The prosecution believed that John had committed the murders because of the grudge John held against Mark for being fired. But John's lawyer stated that he was not fired, but had decided to work on another ship. Many friends and family members of the Coldhurst did not believe that John was the murderer, as they described him as being a pleasant guy who was friendly and always got along with Mark and Irene. One of the witnesses they used was Jeff Pafundi, who was the captain of the Sheila Ryan at the time. He did not recall anything out of the ordinary until more than a month later, when he claimed that on the night of the murders, he heard gunshots and a woman scream. However, he admitted to have been drinking that night. A second witness was the captain of the Libby 8, which was the ship John worked on. The captain, Larry Demeter, stated that he was awoken around 2 in the morning, thinking he heard a woman scream, followed by popping sounds, and then he claimed to see John standing on the dock with what he thought was a rifle. He also stated that the figure looked to be wearing the same hat and sweater as John, and the gun appeared to be one that was usually locked up on the Libby 8 and had an identifiable scope. Larry also stated that John flew home the next day instead of sailing back on the Libby 8. It was stated, but not confirmed, that Larry was testifying for the prosecution to get out of drug charges he had against himself. With still not much of a case for the prosecutors, The jury was unable to come to a unanimous decision, which left them as a hung jury because they did not see a motive for the murders, and the investor ship had sunk to the bottom of the ocean while being scuttled, so there was no crime scene left, and John was a free man. The prosecution was not done with John just yet, and again in 1988, John was once more on trial for the murders of the investor family and crew. This time the jury found 27-year-old John not guilty of the murders. This would lead to John filing a wrongful suit in 1990 against the state, seeking $150 million in damages. In 1997, the lawsuit would be settled, and John would agree to a settlement of $900,000. Many theories surround what may have been a motive for the murders, including that Mark was smuggling drugs on his ship, to one of his own crew members being the culprit. Some believe it may have been the work of a professional hitman, which of course, this was all just speculation. Some also believe that investigators may have overlooked other possible suspects in the case, as they seem to narrow their efforts towards John Peel. One such person may have been Jim Leroy Robinson, who owned Craig Auto, but Jim was really Kenneth Harvey Robertson, who had a history of violent crimes and was a convicted arsonist. He was living in Craig to hide from authorities and was used as one of the prosecution's best witnesses and had not been considered a suspect. It wouldn't be until later, when Kenneth was operating a ship business, that his true identity would come out in 1991, after shipping 12 vehicles to Exxon to clean up the oil spill in 1989. His ship Red Jacket would drop 2 crewmen off on an island to never be seen again. It's been 41 years since the tragic deaths of all 8 investor members, and still to this day, no one has been convicted of the murders, and no one really knows the events that took place that night. Authorities consider the murders to be a closed case. Please like and subscribe, and don't forget to turn on the bell icon to get notifications when I post new videos, and follow me on my Facebook page. Thanks so much again, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos of these strange days we live in.